All right, welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome today to Transforming the Workplace with AI, Ethics, Security, and Innovation. This is a webinar series hosted by Golden Gate University, GGU, and TrustMe.ai. My name is Miria Taig, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for today's discussion on building trust and balancing privacy. I serve as a strategic advisor for TrustMe.ai, where I focus on AI-driven business innovation, workforce transformation, and industry growth. This session is part of our four-part series served to help professionals, businesses, and academic communities navigate the evolving role of AI in the workplace. Our goal is to provide practical insights, real-world examples, and thought-provoking discussions on how AI can be effectively integrated into different industries while maintaining ethical, secure, and people-centric approaches. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a moment to thank our incredible partners at Golden Gate University who have really made this series possible. A special thank you to Sia Zadeh, Judy Lee, and Robert Shoffner, who have played instrumental roles in coordinating this event, providing thought leadership, and ensuring a fantastic experience for our attendees. I'd also like to thank the wider GGU marketing and on-site support team for all of their efforts in making today's event a success. So today, we are going to be focusing on AI ethics in government, building trust and balancing privacy. If you attended our previous webinar, which you can also access online, you'll note that this was a big topic of discussion. We got a lot of follow-up questions about it. So as organizations adopt AI, they face really complex challenges in ensuring fairness, compliance, and transparency, while simultaneously fostering innovation. Our panelists today are going to be sharing insights on key ethical considerations businesses must address when implementing AI, best practices for balancing AI innovation with privacy and security, how governance structures can ensure compliance while maintaining flexibility for AI growth, and last but not least, US versus global considerations for privacy regulations and what that means for the future. We'll start with our panelists' introductions, followed by discussion and conclude with a Q&A session. You can ask questions directly of our experts. Please submit those questions via the chat panel, and we will circle back around to them at the end. So with that out of the way, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, we have Robert Shoffner, Executive Director of the Ageno School of Business, GGU. Robert specializes in AI governance, risk management, and business compliance strategies. He helps organizations navigate regulatory frameworks while leveraging AI responsibly. We also have Sia Zadeh, Chair AI Taskforce for GGU. Sia brings expertise in data security, privacy frameworks, and AI compliance. He advises organizations on best practices for balancing AI innovation with regulatory requirements. And finally, we have Larry Chao, a returning guest as well, Managing Director at the Ethical AI Governance Group and Founding Chief Strategy and Operations Officer for TrustMe.ai. Larry focuses on AI governance, risk, and compliance, helping organizations implement AI responsibly. He'll be discussing the ethical and regulatory considerations companies must prioritize when adopting AI. So on that note, let's dive in. Many of you may know that the AI Action Summit held in Paris last month marked a pivotal moment in the global discourse on artificial intelligence regulation. The summit showcased a divergence in approaches among major international players, reflecting varying priorities and strategies. So let's start with a little bit of a discussion of that. Coming out of the AI Action in Summit last month, what is the current direction of AI regulation? What are some of the things that we've seen? I know, Larry, that this is a topic of interest for you. Do you want to kick us off?
Yes, the Ethical AI Governance Group, we actually were in Paris for that event. We held some panels with leading industry and sort of government officials. And it was really interesting to sort of see sort of the change that we saw versus just a year ago, whereas the conversation was much more around AI safety. This year, it was much more around how do you sort of innovate with AI, how do you sort of build around AI. And what's clear is, we didn't come out of it with one single, global standard or regulatory framework. We did have 60 countries, sign the agreement there, but major players like the US and the UK, they did not. So as we can sort of see, there's going to be continued sort of fragmentation. But I think, with the new administration, but even, we saw Vice President Vance, we saw President Macron, they both talked a lot about sort of how do you sort of build with AI. And so I think the focus, right now is really how do you sort of enable and accelerate AI responsibly in enterprises and in different use cases.
Oh, that's a great direction to hear that we're moving in, particularly as we talk about the theme in the webinar today. So as we talk about all of the different considerations for AI, can you help us understand, Robert or Larry, or Sia, what are the differences between ethical AI, responsible AI, and human-centric AI? I know these are buzzwords, but they have real implications in the world. So somebody kick us off with that.
Sure. I mean, our organization, we started 3 years ago as sort of the ethical AI governance group. And, what we've seen over the years, we've used these terms, ethical AI, responsible AI, human-centric AI, almost somewhat interchangeably. But I think, each of them mean different things. And, despite the fact that, the words in our name, we've even shifted more towards talking about responsible AI and sort of human-centric AI. And so, to me, the difference is, ethical, I think it has certain connotations, but ultimately, I think there are some very localized or sort of regionalized, meanings to it, because what's ethical in the United States might be different than what's ethical in other parts of the world. And that's not to say one is right or one's wrong, but I think there's some, it could be a little charged even to use that word. To me, responsible AI is a little bit broader. It talks about sort of, hey, how do you do governance? How do you sort of do compliance around all of this? And sort of how do you build it sort of around, business practices? And I think that makes a lot of sense, especially with more of these more regulatory frameworks like the EAIGG Act or even like, SOC 2 that sort of have an impact on all of this. And lastly, human-centric AI, I think, that's sort of what we've really been sort of trying to drive at EAIGG is how do you make sure that, AI is there for the benefit of humanity? And what we think is, that's why, for example, we look a lot more at sort of human augmentation versus human replacement kind of sort of use cases and things like that. So I think all of these things, I think they all have sort of the same sort of spirit to them, but there are some devils in the details there.
Yeah, some important differences in that. And see, it looks like you might have had a thought on that.
Yeah, let me pick up on what Larry just shared with us. And I'm going to break it down into different aspects of looking at both responsibility and ethical practice of AI. On the responsible side, it's very context-based. It's a responsibility at the societal level, responsibility at the organizational level. So depending on that, at the societal level, on the larger global level, there are needs for regulation guardrails in terms of that. Europeans have taken a crack at it. There is a draft of EU regulation that is going through all their member countries for review and adoption. And it's based on two key principles. One is a stratification of risk. Make sure there's an understanding of the application of AI in every part of the society or socioeconomic sectors. There is understanding of high risk, medium risk, low risk. Certain sectors, such as healthcare, for instance, this could be a very risky use if it's unmonitored, unguarded, and that. Then that becomes the responsibility. And once that's adopted, then organizations, just similar as it was adopted in early days of the data with what's called the GDPR, the General Data Privacy Regulation, then compliance becomes an issue. It needs to become part of the broader compliance within organization. So the so-called GRC, the governance, risk, and compliance needs to be broadened to include use and utility of AI. So that's more of a responsibility that defines, and you can define it structurally, put it part of your general standard of operation practices that if AI is used, these are the guidelines. They need to provide a transparency, they need to provide documentation. And often organizations need to create a competent group or task force to monitor its use. So it's not using ad hoc randomly. The ethical side of it, if I may add to it, really goes back to the source of data that goes into models. Often data reflects the common practice of society. So there's bias in data. No matter how good of an AI algorithm you create, that bias is going to get reflected into, and AI is increasingly being used as a black box. So those biases may not be very transparent. So definitely there needs to be a review and critical inspection of all the various models that are emerging that if includes bias, that bias does not get automated, reflected society. So really, you can break it down into sub-segment and really provide guidance for each responsible use, compliance, as well as review of all the sources of data, biases in data, and practice.
Yeah, excellent breakdown. So, Robert, I know that this probably falls squarely into your lap as you're taking a look at some of the concerns and considerations that organizations are facing today when they're implementing AI and trying to do so in an ethical and responsible and people-centric way. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you've been seeing?
Well, just to add on to what's been said, the three ethical, responsible, human-centric, they're not separate, they're together. So you need to be thinking about them all at the same time. AI is the hot topic right now. AI is, you can't go anywhere without talking about it. But whether you're a large business or a small business, you need to come up with a well thought out plan of how you're going to implement AI in your organization. For instance, if you're a small organization, do you have the resources to do it? Do you have the capital resources? Do you have the people resources? Who's going to monitor? Who's going to keep things? Who's going to ensure your cybersecurity is up to date, that your privacy guidelines are in place? So I encourage businesses, business leaders to think in terms of come up with a plan for your business with how you're going to implement this, what you need to do, what your algorithms are going to look like. You know, for a small business, you may not want to put in place, if you will, a black box type of algorithm. Because maybe you're going to be, like Larry's going to come and ask you, or someone's going to come and ask you and say, well, can you explain what your algorithm, what it's based on? It looks like it's doing harm to people. And if you're there, well, I really can't answer that question. Things like that, there's very practical considerations. How are you ensuring it's transparent? How are you involving from a governance standpoint? Governance really digs into stakeholders, your employees, your customers, public overall. These are things, how does it affect those individuals from a governance standpoint so that it's inclusive? So that it works for all and it becomes human-centric. It is done on an ethical basis. You have the responsibility guidelines in place. So I lead a business school. One of the things we talk about is that whatever you're doing, always have a closed loop system so that as you've done something, do you take the time to go back and say, what did we learn from that? What do we need to change? What do we need to continue to do? How can this be better? And I would just encourage, the winner is not always going to be who got there fastest. Because you might get there faster than everybody else and you might have a disaster on your hands. So, but if you take the time to plan.
Yes. Yeah, that, closed loop concept, probably also speaks to how do we keep our AI decisions explainable and transparent, which adds to that trust. So, for Sia, Larry, what are some of the things that maybe you would recommend from how do we keep those AI decisions explainable and transparent to help improve that trust and remove bias and kind of move away from that black box approach?
Should I take a crack at it first? I would again suggest to break it down into both your process, your organization, and the resources that you have, as Rob mentioned. In the process, if you plan to incorporate AI into all your activities organization, make sure it's well designed, well documented. Documentation becomes crucial because then if everyone who is receiving some results and outcomes from that use of AI are aware of that, how that decision was made based on what analysis, and then a recurring monitoring of and review of AI is evolving. All the AI models that we are talking about today, probably within a year or two, would be obsolete. New models are going to come. AI is going to go through probably multiple, changes in terms of its, utilization by becoming very customizable to a specific task. It comes to the AI agents. So when that happens, you definitely need to have a very, a constant review and monitoring of what is being used, because that's not going to be stagnant. So that's from the process side. Organizationally, you definitely have to provide, as I said, as part of your standard, practices and standard, operational practices, guidelines about if AI is used, what are the, first is transparency. You have to make sure that, if you're using it, you probably provide transparency in that. As an example is that we have created an AI Taskforce at Golden University. We have set a guidelines for our students across our institution that now we're encouraging them to use AI, rather than the first reaction a few years ago was that do not use AI for any of your course activities. Rather than we have to also adopt and make changes in terms of both our teaching, our pedagogical approach, our assessment and evaluation. So now most of the assessment is that if you use AI, first of all, make sure you cite it as you would do with other references, and then change the assessment or activities to review of the AI response and answer. Provide a critical review of that. Because at the end of the day, we do not want the students or members of the organization to applicate their critical thinking to this black box. Yeah. So that's part of our process. And then, as we have done here, have a group of people like AI Taskforce that works with all the divisions, departments, and become the central focus of guiding, providing policies, and strategic direction. So we can do it at all these levels: procedures, documentation, and organizational structures.
Growing with AI and
exactly.
trying to fight against
absolutely.
it.
Absolutely.
No, I completely agree. So, yeah, and to me, I think there's a couple things that sort of come to mind for this question. I think number one is how can you basically really observe the AI, keep a human in the loop, don't just sort of take what the AI produces as sort of gospel. It's you need to go and sort of run tests, run experiments, try different models, different solutions, and really sort of really keep at it. I think the second thing is you talked about sort of closing the loop, and so how can you sort of bring in all these sorts of different data and sort of do things like that. Like I think like with TrustMe, for example, what TrustMe does is it takes security data, it takes compliance data, it takes productivity data, it takes financial data, and this is a way you can sort of close some of these loops. Whereas you don't always have outcomes with just these raw data sets. So how do you sort of correlate and sort of contextualize the data across all of these different areas? The other thing I would say is we've talked a little bit about sort of transparency. We talked a little bit about the explainability of the models. I think the other key pillar in all this is really sort of accountability, and particularly as AI agents sort of take off, how do you know who did it? Who drove it? And IBM had a slide from 1979 that basically said a computer can never make a management decision because a computer cannot be held accountable. And so how can you sort of provide that accountability there? And so I think technology could is both the problem in a lot of cases, but it can also be a solution to all of this. And I think just like the internet requires on the trust vectors, I think you can apply a lot of these to AI and the data sets and things like that.
Yeah, great insights, and I love that callback to a computer can't make a decision because it's not accountable. And today we're seeing that at the core to so many questions, in terms of how AI is going to develop and change the models that we're going to see evolve over time. So when we're thinking about accountability, this really does come down to data privacy and security as well. And so what role does AI play, and what role do we play in working with AI in terms of data privacy and security? Anyone want to take a stab at that first? It's a big question.
Well, I guess I would start and say you have to. What are the guardrails that you're going to put in place right up front? What's acceptable, what's not acceptable in your space. What are the protections you should put in place? I mean, you could maybe have very lax cybersecurity, very lax privacy regulations. Some of that's going to come from what Larry was talking about. There's going to be things coming down from top. We just had a summit. Here's some general regulations. Now you got to take those regulations and say, how am I going to implement those in my business? What does that mean for do I want to be go a level above that, just meet the standard, be a little bit below it? But it's something that's always going to be evolving. You're going to have to be looking at this every single day, every single month. My former employer was Citigroup, 160 countries around the world. So as they think about those questions, they've got to think about 160 different regulations, different ways this is implemented. Do I have the right firewalls up? Do I have the right standards in place? So it's complicated. And it says to me that it is, one, a separate business unit for a large enough size business. But secondly, it's something that has to be integrated through all of your businesses so that they understand what is being, how you're handling data, how you're handling some of these issues. And then it has to be transparent to the client, to the customer, so the customer understands what you're doing. Because oftentimes we have a clear understanding, but the customer doesn't have any idea, and all of a sudden you're saying, well, yeah, your data did get out. Whoops.
Yeah.
And depending upon your algorithm, you may not really understand what that exactly means.
And I think that leads us really well into the next piece, which is how can businesses balance that AI-driven innovation with the data privacy requirements and user concerns? You know, we talked a little bit about closed loop. We talked about the complexity of it's a constant evolution. This isn't something you put in place once, set it, forget it, cross your fingers, it keeps working. This isn't something that is necessarily universal, as Sia, you were talking about the different ethical requirements, you know, across the world and in different communities. So there are a lot of angles and matrices that we have to be taking into account. So understanding that this is a more general question and we're not speaking to a single business, how can we help our customers and our users feel confident in the privacy requirements and our approach to AI?
I'll answer it from a governance standpoint. Love to hear from our fellow panelists, but let's lean in on inclusivity. How do you involve all your stakeholders in this? What's their point of view? How do they see what you're doing? What questions do they have? What concerns do they have? What suggestions do they have that can actually help you have a better deployment of your AI? Too often we're sort of in the point, well, yeah, this is proprietary information. This is my trade secret. This is my competitive advantage. So I can't share this information. I can't. But if you don't involve your stakeholders, if you're not inclusive, then I argue you may not be getting the best product.
Yes.
That's actually crucial. It's maybe counterintuitive sometimes in our competitive nature that we operate in the business world, but I would favor that as one of the crucial steps in the implementation.
Yeah, that's excellent insights, because the multiple viewpoints not only bring strength to the development, but by involving people, they feel invested, they understand what you're creating and developing, so you're getting that increased likelihood to actually trust and utilize the solution.
I'll give you a couple. I went to a small company, and I was taking students on a tour, and so this is an educational software company training kids on, you know, a startup company. And they were going through something, and so they presented their information. They were talking about entrepreneurship. And we got to the end, and I said, I got a question for you. They said, well, what? I said, well, every entrepreneur that you put up, that you're training the students on, is a white male. Is it not a, you didn't even have a woman. Certainly had no minorities. I said, so is that what you want to do with your AI? And they said, oh, you know, we didn't think about that. Or you might develop a great AI program around underwriting, credit underwriting, which is utilized throughout. Many banks have their own proprietary systems, et cetera. Now, one thing about African American community is that in terms of credit payment, it's not that they don't pay, they generally pay 1 month late. Generally pay one. So do you penalize them? Traditional algorithm would say, oh, they're late, don't extend credit. But if you go a little bit deeper, no, they always pay. It's just that they're paying generally 1 month late. And that's a broad statement, it's not across the board. But maybe you just factor that into what your rate is. So those are the things you have, those type of things. And you might get that, you might not get that internally, but you might get that if you had a group of multiple stakeholders that weigh in on what you're doing.
Wider cohort, very much the same principles applied to, as we are testing new drugs or working with the FDA, making sure that you have a representative cohort before you release your product. So Larry, I see you kind of nodding along. It looks like you might have some thoughts on this.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately this is why it's really important to have really good clarity and sort of executive buy-in in terms of, what you're trying to accomplish with all of this. Because I think, it isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of, problem and sort of solution. And so, for example, like, if you're in certain industries, accuracy is of the most importance. But in other industries, like you'd rather the LLM hallucinate than reveal like your social security number or sort of other kind of private, sort of information. And I think sort of having that clarity in mind can help you sort of find the right decisions in terms of how you go out and sort of execute and sort of implement this. Like I've seen startups that basically what they do is they basically will add noise to the system so you don't actually reveal really private information. Or they even do that because, the AI systems, they can actually learn to game and cheat a little bit.
Yes.
And so you basically have to almost sort of keep them on their toes. And so I think a lot of this is really sort of understand, hey, what is the number one thing here? And sort of, is our use case, really suitable for what data we have and what we're trying to accomplish? And that's why I think, the future is going to be around sort of these, industry-specific data sets and small language models, rather than everybody using the same llama model for everything.
Yeah. And Sia, that comes back to, what you were talking about, not losing our critical thinking.
Correct.
As we're using these solutions, we know that some of these models hallucinate, they game the system, they make things up. And so we do have to apply our human thought process to that. But I know that as we're thinking about our own responsibility to help in AI, we have different regulations starting up across the US versus globally.
Absolutely.
What are some of the things that we need to be aware of? I know you recently were invested in the EU draft in particular, and kind of what does that look like for us?
Well, this is the kind of conversation I always have with my students. So first thing I always tell them that I view AI as the ultimate collaboration between man and machine. And that's collaboration, not a replacement of our own critical thinking. So if we view AI and any type of model that emerges in the future as augmentation of our own brain power, our own critical thinking, and used in a very responsible, ethical way, actually we would see a lot of benefits from it. Let me share an example of AI in industry that's always dear to me, healthcare. First of all, AI is not panacea for all our social ills. If there's an industry that is a significant inequity, it's healthcare, because of multiple socio-economic determinants that causes that inequity. But also that's an industry that's always under-resourced. And as we witnessed during the past few years of COVID, that whenever we have such an emergency or pandemic, we're never going to have an adequate resource to all that. But AI is now promises to provide support and augment across the spectrum from the administration side of it for care coordination, care management. But there's significant volume of data, which is referred to as a patient longitudinal data, that can be analyzed, especially for patients with chronic diseases, to provide and guide the care coordinators, care managers toward a very streamlined based on their morbidity, comorbidity, and age-wise. All those risk factors are there. And why not leverage that to analyze that information, to identify and stratify our patient population by risk factors, provide that. On the clinical side, already it's been deployed. All our imaging tests, whether it's MRI, X-ray, CAT scan, PET scan, all being viewed by computer-aided detection diagnostics, with AI detects patterns that are anomalous to, again, aid the clinician and radiologist for a better identification, and then provide coverage, especially on health prevention and care prevention, early stage of these in countries such as India, China, which have very large population. And you're never going to be able to provide a kind of direct service to every one of them. So there are promises for that. But again, that is the same industry, at the same time, it's highly regulated. Privacy is important in that industry. That's why they have HIPAA regulation. So AI is not going to be exempt from those privacy regulation. They're not going to be exempt from security. So as you mentioned, balancing between streamlining, improving business processes, and innovation is always with considering the context and all the rules and regulation of it. But there is a promise for it too. At the same time, that's why, if we don't want to really over-regulate it because we stifle innovation. At the same time, we don't want to have it under-regulated because it creates this chaos and has more harm to that.
Yeah. So on that topic of, with us trying to find that balance between we don't want to overprocess and overregulate and stifle it. We don't want to under-regulate or have too many diverging regulations that can create loopholes and gaps. What are some of the best practices? As we take a look at AI systems, how do we stay compliant with evolving regulations? How do we make some of those difficult decisions? I think, Robert, you spoke a little bit about it as well earlier, saying, well, if the regulation is at this level, do we choose to exceed that, meet it? Do we kind of skim underneath it? How do we stay current? Larry, Robert, do you want to take that?
Sure. So yeah, I think one of the challenges of sort of this fragmentation is if you want to be a global company, you have to be familiar with what's going on in Europe and Singapore, United States, and things are all very, very different. And I think one view is that some people think the EU AI Act is going to be sort of the standard, similar to how GDPR was and all of that. But I think, ultimately, I think this is where part of the solution I think is actually technological, because I think a lot of it's similar to, I used to work for a startup that basically worked in the commercial construction industry. And so back then, we basically had general contractors would pre-qualify their subcontractors, and they would look at their safety record, they would look at their financials, they would look at all of these kinds of things. But the challenge was, every GC, every general contractor had a different standard for what qualifies a startup than another. And so this is one of those areas where I think technology can play a real role in it, because you basically can sort of ask the same set of questions. You can format it in sort of these different frameworks. I think that's something that's not going to be a cure-all, but it's going to help you sort of navigate through this stuff. And I think there's will be additional benefits to other compliance frameworks like SOC 2, or even your own cybersecurity or sort of privacy policy, things like that. So I think there is sort of this sort of technological aspect to how you can sort of navigate through some of these things with that. I think the other thing is, particularly I think sort of where things are right now, where we're seeing more and more push for innovation versus maybe regulation. I think there's going to be some decentralized approaches that can really help sort of solve this. One thing that we sort of talked about is it may not be the U.S. government that demands you meet this requirement, or the EU that needs you to. It's like you, when you're looking at for your vendors that provide you AI solutions or whatnot, you want them to do reach things at a certain standard. And so, I've seen startups to have sort of more of a blockchain, sort of token or protocol kind of approach to sort of show that level of trust. And then you can also have that sort of level of social proof. And so, again, not saying that technology is the end-all and be-all solution to this, but I think things like this will help make this all much more scalable. And I think, right now it feels like it's going to be more the markets than perhaps the government that will sort of dictate this, but it'll keep going back and forth. We'll see.
Oh, those interesting insights, and I love the example of the complexity in the real world with GCs.
Yeah.
So you led really well into some of the next conversations that we want to have around the future of AI governance. Right now is complex enough, as we all know. It's part of why we're having these conversations. But how, you mentioned decentralization. How do we see AI regulations evolving over, let's say, the next 5 years, or even over the next year? Sia, it looks like you've got some thoughts on that.
Well, I'm picking up on what Larry was saying. AI is advancing. And as we are approaching more what we call AGI, the artificial general intelligence, which there's basically, thinking behind it. Could be self-learning. Also, I envision a self-regulating AI models. I mean, definitely there is enough science and enough technology understanding to build even AI models that are self-regulating.
Yeah.
And as we are going to be approaching more of compliance, but that could be actually very customized, very context-based, very industry-based. For instance, the self-regulating AI in healthcare will be very different than finance. Right now, finance is using AI significantly for fraud detection, which is, again, empowering the industry to monitor billions of transactions on a daily basis, which is beyond any human capabilities to do that. But at the same time, as you want to allow these transactions go place, you want to keep building these self-regulating models of fraud detection, update that. Other industries, manufacturing, supply chain, there are so many different ways, and the model that I think Larry's proposing is type of decentralized, context-based, industry-based regulation. It's going to be probably the norm, as happened like FDA governs certain industries, agricultural department covers the food supply chain, and other industries have OSHA supports manufacturing and others.
Right.
So we kind of see the same model approach, leveraging the advancement technology algorithms, but customization into that specific industry.
Yeah, that checks and balances built in and that regulation
Absolutely.
built in.
Absolutely.
So Robert, as we talk about that, I know that business leadership and helping guide them is a huge part of what you do. What responsibilities do business leaders have in guiding ethical AI adoption, regulations, and growth as we consider all of the options?
Well, first and foremost, whenever you're talking about ethics, it's not just putting out, here's my document that says we're going to do this ethically, and everybody signed off on it, and that solves the issue.
Yep.
Business leaders are going to, they're going to have to be knowledgeable. They don't have to be experts, but they have to be knowledgeable about AI and the implications for their business. And they have to talk about it. They have to walk the walk, talk the talk, say what they expect, and write about it, if you will. Let people know about it.
Socialize it and educate, yeah.
I would think, it took over 100 years for the Business Roundtable to move from the sole purpose of business is to make money. And then about maybe 10 years ago, they finally added in, but there is a social responsibility. There is other things that business needs to be concerned with. And maybe at some level from the top down, you want to have some general statements around this technology, what business believes, Business Roundtable, the San Francisco organization, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, others around AI. And then I could see utilizing what Larry has said and what Sia said around utilizing technology to do some of the monitoring. But maybe there's some standards you put in place. Maybe there's an ISO. Maybe there's something that says, I'm ISO certified gold or platinum, et cetera, around this technology and how we deploy it, how we use it within our organization, so that you get to some standards that you strive towards, that make sense and are recognized throughout the industry, that you're deploying ethically, you're deploying responsibly. You have thought about your employees there's so many different aspects of things you should be concerned about. I remember one organization said, well, we're training everybody in our organization, senior leaders and up to upper middle level individuals, but we're not telling our lower level employees anything about AI. They don't even have a chance to take the training. I said, so that's almost that they're going to say at some point, I've heard that there's going to be $85 million jobs lost. Am I going to be one of them?
Right.
So it's, again, I'll come back to, it's not just writing something out. You have to, for your own individual organization, how are you demonstrating every day? It's important. Perhaps it becomes now a really detailed part of your annual reports to your shareholders, et cetera.
Yeah, I love the combination of not only setting the standards, but the education, the iteration, the bringing the larger cohort into that conversation, which all comes back to what we've been talking about transparency and trustworthiness in order to increase the adoption and the ethical utilization of AI. So as we're thinking about that, more and more organizations, more and more industries are using AI in different and distinct ways. What are some of them that are doing really well right now? What are some of the ones, as you said, gold standard, platinum standard, that we should be looking to and learning from? I mean, Larry and Sia, I know you work across a lot of these industries. Which ones really stand out to you?
Some of the industries that I think are basically putting together a process and organization to that is healthcare. FDA already has a group of people and authority on trying to decide with the input from the practitioners, clinicians, and providers and payers of space on what are the rules and regulation that should be incorporated, should it become part of the existing, let's say, HIPAA regulation. Because the first thing is that regardless of what you do, data privacy is still a upper standard for that. Is there any data breaches? There is a very well-defined standard operation procedure that what needs to be done. In fact, government can bring felony charges against executives in those organizations if there is a negligence and data breach as a result of that negligence. AI would not going to basically relieve them from that responsibility. So that now, in use of it in more of the clinical and all that is very critical because the impact would be on the human life. So that is being reviewed extensively, just like as I mentioned for drug discovery, drug clinical. We put any new application of a new drug into very extensive clinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. Same thing with this one here. This is just technology. Medical devices that are going to come with AI embedded. So they're going to go through the high scrutiny. We all are aware of the various variables that are coming out, various monitoring, space, all that. They're all going to become the next generation of the AI equipped, meaning that not only they collect data, but they could actually do an analysis right away. I mean, the Apple Watch can do an EKG these days. So that actually, if it's used properly, responsibly, could provide good information for first responders when you rush into less than emergency unit of it, of that too. So there are areas that, so they are putting exactly that. So that's one industry that I think it's good to monitor. Legal industry also is grappling with it because we've seen a significant increase in number of startups in legal to draft briefs, draft contracts, and various other documentation, do the research for them. But again, same thing needs to happen in that industry there. So the Bar Association are also looking at that, see what it should be the responsible use of AI for that process. Again, taxation. In fact, we have a colleague who teaches at the School of Tax and Accounting. The tax, especially the auditing segment of it, is going to be using AI quite a bit. Again, you don't want to be replacing the human monitoring of it, rather than should be an augmentation to human monitoring of it. So we can look at these industries doing it within the US, and while looking at the broader, because as I was mentioned, there's not a single regulation that's going to address all the different and complexity of large economic activities here. So we definitely need to customize it specific to the really context of that industry. So there are 2-3 industries that actually we can see as a role model for other industries.
And what an interesting fact that so many of these industries, part of what we're seeing is the confluence of pre-existing structures, and being driven by the market, but then human impact. And that was a big part of what we talked about in our previous webinar. And when we combine those 3 elements, rather than just relying on one or the other, that's where we're seeing true success and the beginnings of the gold or platinum standard. Larry, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the easy answer or short answer is obviously the technology industry has been really at the forefront of this. But I think essentially technology is not really an industry anymore because it touches every vertical, like Sia mentioned. It's in legal, it's in healthcare, it's whatnot. And so the way I look at it is I think there's certain functions or certain sectors that are more amenable to some of the current adoptions. I think with Gen AI, it's a lot about sort of text and content. So that's why I think from marketers to developing content and blogs and social media to even like software developers to some degree, they can basically help use AI as a way to sort of generate code. I think that's one aspect. I think the other aspect is with all of the mass amount of data thanks to IoT and sensors out there, I think just something that can sort of help tackle the scale, whether it's cybersecurity or an IT or whatnot. And so I think it's the key thing I look at is for the most part, AI isn't there to necessarily replace specific jobs, or specific tasks, specific functions, and that's how I think it could be an augmentation play where it's not there to replace the radiologist, but it can basically take care of some of these tasks that that they need to do to sort of do their job.
Yeah, and we're seeing already wonderful examples of AI in combination with a radiologist discovering, a latent melanoma when it's a couple of cells. And that's something that couldn't happen without that intersection. So now that we've kind of talked about where the gold standard and some of the really great examples are, I think that's a great place for us to transition to some of the questions that we're seeing from our audience. So Sia, you mentioned earlier artificial general intelligence versus narrow AI or AI. And we have a question about what is the difference between those two things?
Well, the current practice and models and algorithm there, it is really a narrow version of AI. The artificial general intelligence is going to broaden that to the point of the self-learning capabilities and other aspects that it really it becomes ideally a human, very similar to human cognitive capabilities.
Yes.
So that's where we're heading for. We're not there yet.
No.
I think any notion that we're going to get there in the next few months, that's premature. But generally, the trend is aiming toward that. Now, some people consider it possibly have a perspective on it is apocalyptic. I don't espouse that view. I think as we've seen throughout all the various industrial revolution, 1.0 now to 4.0, all advancement usually has been, over the long term in the benefit of the human society, mankind, if it's used properly, if it's used ethically, responsibly. That's why we definitely need to have the high level of discourse within our society and globally about an ethical, responsible use of AI that incorporates all the aspects we mentioned, the human-centric AI, responsible AI, ethical use. At the same time, it allows innovation in business, a streamline of processes, and use for, improve all the aspects of business. Those are not mutually exclusive, in my view, if you balance, responsible. So that's why the Edge AI is a much broader and more general aspect of it. That's why
Excellent answer to that. So this is something that we covered a little bit earlier, actually quite a lot earlier, around regulations and compliance, and we talked a lot about self-regulating. But this is an interesting question that says, as we're seeing changes in our federal government, as we're seeing regulations being removed and courts may not be used for the enforcement, what regulations are left as we think about, is it driven by the market? Is it driven by us as the users? Is it driven by, global standards? And so if anyone wants to speak to kind of what does that look like for us in the future?
I mean, I think one thing I would say is, what we're seeing is here in the United States, it's going to be much more fragmented. It's probably not going to be the federal government that leads it, but certain states like California, for example, I think are going to continue to sort of push forward. And so, SB 1047 last year, that didn't end up passing, but I think, I imagine there'll be other attempts to sort of drive things like that. And so it's, like I said, it's here in the US, it's going to be very fragmented. Europe as a whole, they're sort of have this sort of standardized thing across sort of the whole continent. But then a number of countries recently in Asia and elsewhere have sort of started to sort of take their stakes. I think for the most part is, the general view is like most of them are more light touch and they're more concerned with preserving innovation than sort of the regulatory aspect. But again, I think things will sort of continue to sort of change and sort of evolve. And so, like I said, I think the markets will play a role, the governments will play a role, and I think it's going to be up to the companies to sort of navigate and sort of make the choices between all of these different frameworks that they have to deal with.
Yeah, that's, a great way of how we're going to maintain, just because the federal government may not be, the end-all be-all for what we're looking for, we have personal responsibility and capability. So as we think about maintaining the public trust, because I think that question actually spoke to what's going to happen. Can I continue to trust AI? Who's going to help protect me? What are some of the strategies that businesses, education, or individuals can use to help maintain that public trust as we are deploying AI? You spoke about ensuring that we have a broader cohort representation. We spoke about closed loop and about ensuring transparency and communication. Are there any other strategies, even more generally as we're thinking about the public, that we should all be taking accountability for?
One thing, I would just first off say, we need more TrustMe.ai type organizations to, one, talk about it. Secondly, as educators, we need to ensure that we are teaching ethical, responsible, human AI concepts, philosophies, so that our students and future business leaders, future managers understand what that means. We're going to have some fragmented regulations. Something will be at the federal level, something at the state, maybe in, not local, but state. And within that, still, over that mantle is, so is this what you did ethical? Did it meet social standards, et cetera? Is this responsible? How are you helping consumers? Has this harmed the consumer? Can you answer questions that are coming from various stakeholders? If you keep those things in place along with regulations, I believe you'll build trust. When you can't answer questions like that, people are saying, I don't know if I should, well, you really didn't say anything. So how can I trust you? Trust comes from transparency. Trust comes from involving more people. So it's a combination of some of those concepts we talked about along with regulations. You can just put the regulations there. That's not necessarily going to build trust.
Right.
If I may add, I think if we go back to look at the old cliche of trust by verify, that could also apply that too. We're going to be using at a different level for personal purpose, for our organization, for our jobs, AI in a variety of format, levels, all that. And you may at sometimes find your favorite models to use and trust it, but always need to verify. I think just like any other activities we've done in the past in our human history, trust always needs to go verification. That does not mean you do not have a trust. You could build a trust, but you always continuously need to monitor, audit, update, and verify it to enhance, in fact, that bond of trust among all the stakeholders in it to be able to use it effectively, responsibly, and ethically.
Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously with TrustMe, right, the company name, it sort of talks about trust. I think, TrustMe is looking at a lot of different ways to sort of how you sort of, communicate and sort of measure trust. And I think one aspect of it is actually, having like a FICO-like score, where you, just like you can sort of evaluate a business of it, you can sort of evaluate based on things like, hey, what kind of policies they have, what kind of security they have in mind. And I think that's, one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is sort of this sort of social proof aspect, and sort of understanding not only what certifications you have, but who else uses your platform, all sort of things like that. I think it's just like, I've seen some, really interesting, startup concepts where some people want to sort of create, things where they evaluate people or companies or whatnot. Like, not saying any one thing is the answer, but I think it's going to be sort of a combination of all of these different things, looking at sort of what you can sort of prove yourselves, what other people say about you, and sort of how you can sort of document some of this information.
Yeah, and I don't think we could end on a better note than the three of you closing this out with trust and the transparency, the accountability, and the people element of AI that we keep on bringing to this series. So a huge thank you to our panelists for sharing your invaluable insights. Thank you to all of you for being here today. As we know, AI is rapidly reshaping our workplace, and our lives. And our goal is to equip you with the knowledge, the tools, the perspectives needed to navigate this transformation effectively. So before we wrap up, I encourage you to join us for the next webinar in our series, which will be also a webinar, but also in person during Campus Week here at GGU. More details will come out in the follow-up email. And in the meantime, please don't hesitate to reach out to TrustMe with any questions at contact@TrustMe.ai or any of our panelists whose information we'll be sharing. Finally, I'd like to extend another thank you to our GGU partners, Sia Zadeh, Judy Lee, and Robert Shoffner for your leadership and support, as well as a huge thank you to the GGU marketing and on-site teams for all of your hard work in making this event happen. Access to the recording on YouTube, connections with our panelists, exploring helpful resources, and feedback via the survey will all be available in the follow-up email, so keep an eye out for that. Again, I'm Miria Taig, and it's been a pleasure to moderate today's session. See you at the next session. Thanks all.